This is the eighth episode of the Mendez Movie Report Podcast, representing the film industry news that caught my attention the most for the week of June 15th, 2026. I am your host and namesake film critic, Luis A. Mendez. And on this episode, I'll be giving my thoughts on Steven Spielberg's latest film, Disclosure Day, which is getting very mixed responses from audiences. I pay tribute to legendary film critic Gene Shalit, react to the Oscars giving honorary statues to Glenn Close and Ridley Scott, talk to ADG firing back at Martin Scorsese, I look at The Rock Dwayne Johnson's candid interview, respond to two attacks on two favorite films of mine, and I take Jane Campion to task for yet another embarrassing gaffe. And as always, I look at the latest box office news along with what's coming next at theaters and streaming. And the good news is, folks, is that I am getting closer and closer to actually having the space and time to work on getting a proper intro for you after some shifting around in my schedule. I've been able to work out a little bit of a deal with the current wife about how we're going to be doing some weekly stuff, which will hopefully open things up for me in my film criticism. But regardless, it is a stacked episode. We've got a lot to cover, so we may as well get started. And of course, the biggest news of the last week when it came to film was the fact that we have got a brand new Steven Spielberg film. We actually are getting a brand new Steven Spielberg film, the first since The Fabelmans. And, you know, with the country's 250th anniversary really right around the corner, Steven Spielberg, you know, he was honored with a special MPA America 250 award for his legendary achievements. You know, he is arguably America's greatest and most influential filmmaker. When you hear the name Spielberg, you automatically picture him in the director's chair. But he's also spent decades producing films and television projects. For instance, he served as a producer on last year's Hamnet, one of my favorite films of 2025 and a Best Picture contender. In fact, I believe that it was a likely top 3 Best Picture contender at the Oscars. And, you know, whether he's directing or producing, Spielberg has devoted his life to bringing stories to the screens, both big and small. And in a way, Spielberg is the grandpapa of big studio filmmaking in the same way Martin Scorsese is for auteur-driven cinema and film preservation. That's not to say that Spielberg lacks a tourist signature of his own, but you know, there's a reason he was chosen to present Christopher Nolan, the filmmaker I would consider my generation Spielberg, with his Oscar. Spielberg has been known for personally reaching out to directors to congratulate them and offer advice following their success. You know, John M. Chu recalled in an interview I saw where he showed Spielberg Wicked, and he was being asked detailed questions about how certain sequences were accomplished. Spielberg was chosen to do a live Q&A with Paul Thomas Anderson after the first DGA screening of One Battle After Another last year. You know, Godzilla Minus One director Takashi Yamazaki was brought to tears at the Oscars nominees luncheon when Spielberg told him how much he loved the film, and Yamazaki referred him you know, he referred to the legendary filmmaker as a god. Like the love and respect in the industry, especially among filmmakers for Spielberg, is just the highest that you can find. I would argue maybe even higher than Scorsese, which is kind of wild to say. Um, you know, Spielberg has given us great films across basically every genre, or at least almost every genre. He still hasn't done a Western. He still hasn't done a horror film, unless you believe the stories that he kind of ghost directed Poltergeist, the first one. But you know, even the movies of his that I'm personally not particularly wild about, they're still impressively crafted, and plenty of his work has landed on my year-end best of list. Not all of them, like certain other directors that I revered, but a lot. Almost all of them are at least, if not top 10, top 20 for me in their year. But you know, there are tiers to this. Spielberg, he has his old-time favorites of mine, like Jaws and Jurassic Park. He has films starting the masterpiece conversation, like Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan. He has movies that I think are great, even if they probably don't make like all time lists, like The Fablemans and Bridge of Spies. Um, and he has middling efforts, Ready Player One, the BFG, and he has had some occasional duds like 1941. Yet Spielberg's overall filmography is the kind most filmmakers would kill for. And after a few years away, he's back in the director's chair, and that is always an exciting prospect. This time around, Spielberg is returning to the sci-fi spectacle he hasn't really tackled in a while. His latest film is Disclosure Day, a movie that's just from speculating about whether there is life out there to asking what happens when humanity discovers there is. And he gets to tell the story with an incredible ensemble that includes Emily Blunt, Josh O'Connor, Colin Firth, Coleman Domingo, and Wyatt Russell, among others. And when reviewing a Spielberg film at this stage of his career, a few questions are naturally going to come to mind. Is this Spielberg doing what he does best? How does it stack up against the rest of his filmography? Will it be one of those films that leaves a lasting mark on the medium and with audiences? Is it one of the best films of the year? Thankfully, I was privileged enough to attend a press screening of Disclosure Day just last week, before the film was available to the audiences worldwide. And I could ask those questions and get answers to those questions, or at least my subjective view of what the answers to those questions were. And the good news is that for much of its runtime, I believe the answer to most of these questions is a reassuring yes. Spielberg does get to show off what he does best at times in this film. It stacks up on the better end of his filmography, if you ask me, though I wouldn't put it next to his old timers. Now, I'm not sure if it will leave a lasting mark on the medium, and we will eventually get to have some conversation about the mixed audience reception that I have seen for this movie, but it is a contender to be among my personal favorites by year's end. If not top 10, definitely top 20. Like, if this movie can't make a top 20 list of mine, then this year's about to get really ridiculous in the second half. One of the reasons Spielberg has remained relevant across so many decades is that he understands something many filmmakers working with massive budgets and high concepts often forgetting that the spectacle only matters if the audience cares about the people experiencing it. It doesn't matter how impressive the visual effects are or how large the stakes become if there isn't a human story anchoring everything. It's why films like E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Jurassic Park have endured for generations. Disclosure Day understands this as well. At its core, this is a science fiction film about humanity confronting the possibility that we are not alone in the universe. But Spielberg wisely approaches the material through the eyes of people rather than through the endless exposition and lordoms. The film spends much of its first half introducing us to a collection of characters trying to make sense of a world that may be on the verge of the most important discovery in human history. Some are excited, some are terrified, some see opportunity, others see a challenge to everything they believe. Leading that ensemble is Emily Blunt, who gives what is easily the best performance in the film and may honestly be one of the strongest performances of her career. Blunt has always been an actress capable of bringing emotional complexity with blockbuster material, but Spielberg gives her room to do more here. There are scenes where she has to communicate wonder, fear, skepticism, hope, and grief all within a matter of minutes, and she pulls it off effortlessly. She's doing things like speaking different languages, having no control of what her mind knows. If there is an MVP award to hand out for Disclosure Day, it belongs to her. And because of that, I do think she's going to be at the very least in the conversation for a lead actress nomination. The supporting cast is strong across the board as well. Josh O'Connor continues the streak of proving he can fit into virtually any genre. Coleman Domingo brings his visual gravitas and charisma. Colin Firth delivers as the main antagonist. I thought Wyatt Russell provided solid support as Blunt's less than supportive partner. And personally, I found Eve Hewson, who apparently is I learned through listening to the Mike and Mike podcast review of this movie. I didn't know this. She's apparently Bono's daughter, and she's, She's very captivating. To me, nobody feels miscast. I know some people have complained about Wild Russell, but to me, nobody feels miscast. Nobody feels like they're just here collecting a paycheck. This is an ensemble that appears fully invested in Spielberg's vision. Visually, the film is stunning to look at, but that's always a given with a cinematographer like Janusz Kaminski, even though I know some people have argued, can Spielberg finally work with a different cinematographer after these 30 plus years? Spielberg has always known where to place the camera, but there are several sequences here that remind you why so many directors still study his work. There's quiet moments between characters. Um, the cinematography always elevates the material because in scenes the movie frequently finds beauty in both the ordinary and extraordinary, which feels fitting given the story it's trying to tell. There are chase sequences in here that deserve particular praise. Spielberg remains one of the best filmmakers to ever direct action because he understands geography and momentum. You always know where everyone is. You understand the stakes. The scenes build naturally rather than relying on chaotic editing to manufacture excitement. Several of the film's biggest set pieces had me leaning forward in my seat in a way that reminded me of why Spielberg is the king of the summer blockbuster in the first place. The film is also packed with references to real world stories involving alleged extraterrestrial encounters. Some viewers may miss a few of these but people familiar with UFO folklore and conspiracy culture will likely have a great time spotting the inspirations. Spielberg clearly had fun incorporating decades worth of stories, rumors, and infamous incidents into the narrative. I will tell you, I I do not believe that alien existence of alien life is being hidden by the government. But I did grow up big time on watching a lot of documentaries, knowing a lot of the conspiratorial lore. And there were so many times that I was like that Leonardo DiCaprio meme pointing at the screen every time there were references to different lores, about the government supposedly hiding the existence of these aliens. Another aspect I appreciate was the film's willingness to engage with questions of fate. Science fiction often explores what humanity would do if we discovered life beyond Earth, but Disclosure Day spends surprising amount of time considering what such a revelation might mean for people whose worldviews are built around religious belief. The film doesn't mock faith and nor does it preach. Instead, it treats the subject with genuine curiosity and has some interesting philosophical and theological statements. Whether viewers agree with his conclusions will vary, but I appreciate that Spielberg was interested in exploring those questions at all. And then there is John Williams. I cannot remember the last time I walked out of a late career Williams score feeling this energized about it. For years now, it has occasionally felt like the legendary composer was operating on autopilot, delivering competent work without the memorable themes that once defined his career, but not here. This score has life, it has energy, it has moments of awe. It felt like Williams was genuinely inspired by the material, and the film is significantly better because of it. Unfortunately, Disclosure Day is another reminder that even Spielberg is not immune to the modern blockbuster's inability to leave well enough alone. This movie absolutely did not need to be 2.5 hours long. There is a tighter, more effective version of this film hiding somewhere inside the finished product. Entire sections could have been trimmed without sacrificing character development or thematic depth. Such a scene involved there is such a scene like this involving destroying a phone that criminally went on too long. Like is probably the one time in the movie that I mentally sighed. And if you have not seen this movie yet, when you see it, you will understand what I'm talking about when we get to that scene. The pacing never completely collapses, but there are stretches where the film feels like it's circling ideas that it's already communicated rather than pushing forward. My bigger issue, however, is philosophical. Without diving into spoiler territory, the film ultimately arrives at a place of profound optimism regarding humanity at the face of such a game changing discovery. Spielberg has always possessed a hopeful streak, and for many viewers, that will likely be one of the film's greatest strengths. There is something admirable about a filmmaker at the end of his career still choosing to believe in our better angels. I just don't entirely sharing that optimism right now, given the current state of the world. The film's faith in humanity does occasionally feel disconnected from the reality so many of us are experiencing. Now that is not necessarily a objective flaw. In fact, I suspect there are plenty of viewers who will find the movie's hopeful perspective refreshing and perhaps even moving. But for me personally, some of its emotional conclusions landed with less impact than probably would have at another point in time. And I do think I do have when I do get to the subject about this movie's divisive audience scores, I think that might be one of the things that is driving those mixed responses from general audiences. Um, and I did want to mention real quick about the finale without spoiling specifics. The climax is certainly ambitious. Spielberg swings for the fences, delivers imagery that is meant to inspire awe and wonder on a massive scale, and it works for the most part. It does, but there are a few times it doesn't, and unfortunately, there were moments during the final act where I couldn't shake the feeling that was almost like watching a collection of AI generated TikTok reels stitched together in a feature length sequence. Um, the imagery becomes so overwhelming, so relentless that it occasionally loses the emotional grounding that made the earlier portions of the film as effective. Uh, but still, even with those reservations, I walked away really liking Disclosure Day. It is is it one of Spielberg's masterpieces? No. Is it on the level of Jaws, Jurassic Park, Saving Private Ryan, or Schindler's List? Not remotely. But is it a good Spielberg film? Absolutely. And a good Spielberg film is the greatest film other directors have made. At a time when many legendary directors might be slowing down, repeating themselves, struggling to connect with modern audiences, Spielberg remains remarkably capable of delivering entertaining, thoughtful, and emotionally engaging blockbuster filmmaker. Disclosure Day may not rank among the very best work of his career, but it is another reminder that even an imperfect Spielberg film still possesses a sense of craft, wonder, and humanity that many filmmakers spend entire careers trying to achieve. And that is why I give this film a solid grade of A minus. Again, the pros: Spielberg's magic touch when it comes to tackling sci-fi connecting with real human emotion shines through. Great performances led by Emily Blunt as MVP, exciting chase sequences, a lot of reference to infamous supposed extraterrestrial contact stories, touches on aspects of faith while grappling with would-be discovery that there is life out there. John Williams finally doesn't nail one of his scores for the first time in years, and some great cinematography. The gripes that I have, the cons: this movie really shouldn't be 2.5 hours long. Movie ultimately leads to a trust in humanity that doesn't have much appeal for me at the current time. Um, and the finale almost feels like watching a collection of TikTok AI reels back to back. But again, overall, this was an entertaining sci-fi film that makes you think a little. And because of that, I ultimately come down to an A minus. I highly, highly recommend Disclosure Day personally for those of you who have not seen it yet. Now, that does bring us, though, to the elephant in the room regarding Disclosure Day and its mixed audience responses versus critics. So, let's dive into this past weekend in new movies and Steven Spielberg's Disclosure Day, which again I give an A minus review to that you can read if you want to. Again, I'll leave it in the show notes, the link. It's looking at a worldwide opening for a little under 100 million, with more than 40 million of that coming domestically. If it does the legs they're hoping it will, it should come away with a pretty nice 200 to 300 million dollar worldwide gross. I do fear the legs for this movie could prove weak because look, the critical scores have been pretty solid, but the audience scores are definitely some of the most middling scores I've seen for a Spielberg film. I went back and looked. You have to look back to the post, the last time audiences clearly liked the Spielberg film less than critics did, and you have to go back to the BFG to the last time audiences gave a movie from him a worse audience scores than this one. And I'm baffled by it, but Among critics, last I checked, that holds an 80% of Rotten Tomatoes and a 74 Metacritic. Not anything special, but good reviews for the most part. Among audiences, however, it has just a 73% on the popcorn meter, a 3.3 on Letterboxd, a 6.8 on IMDb, and just a B cinema score. Um and I've been wondering about this because first of all, by the way, you can also linking to the show notes. I did a radio segment with Ohio Valley's the Watchdog Morning Show to talk with Howard Monroe about the film, and I wonder how many people who listen to that are now wondering about my taste, given these legitimately mixed scores from audiences. And I do wonder, like, is the movie too hopeful or what? But then again, Project Hail Mary is a pretty hopeful crowd pleaser, and that movie has arguably the best audience scores of the year so far. So it is fascinating to me watching how mixed audiences have been on the movie compared to critics. Were they expecting something else? Were they expecting some kind of like action thriller? Were they expecting the aliens to be consistently all over the film? Did the marketing affect what they expected of the film? Is kind of like the debate that was going on last year with Materialist, which is a movie that I thought would have much better audience scores than it ended up happening. Um, so I really don't know what it is, but I was getting so much feedback from non-critics that I'm mutuals with on Letterboxd, or we're not mutuals, but they follow me and they show up a lot in my mentions, and it does seem like general audiences were more underwhelmed by this movie than your average film critic was, and that to me makes me concerned about its box office things. It makes me concerned about if its awards prospects. Um, and it'll be definitely something to keep an eye on. Like it doesn't make me feel wrong about me giving the film this review that I did. I didn't feel wrong about my Michael review, regardless what some people out there were saying. I'm not. It's the same thing when it's the reverse way. I mean, I think I like this movie more than audiences seem to have. Now, one film I forgot to touch on last week was the new international action flick, The Furious, which has been generating some strong word of mouth and putting up a respectable showing at the specialty box office. Among critics, it's got a whopping 97% on Rotten Tomatoes and an 85 Metacritic score. Audiences have responded with even better audience scores. 95% of the popcorn meter, 3.8 on Letterboxd, 7.9 on IMDb, and the rare A cinema score. I can tell you the word of mouth on this has been really, really good, and I'll definitely be trying to check this one out in due time. Meanwhile, out of the box office into the streaming world, Netflix's straight to streaming animated feature I Am Frank Helda has also been earning a strong notices from both critics and audiences. Among critics, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 75 on Metacritic. Among audiences, it holds a 7.1 on IMDb. I did catch this one over the weekend and thought it was a decent little movie that's worth checking out if you're looking for something new to watch on the app. But that basically wraps it up on this past weekend. Disclosure Day, good reviews, mixed audience response. The Furious, big hit with both critics and audiences. I Am Frank Hilda, pretty good responses from both critics and audiences. Okay, now what do we have to look forward to next weekend in new movies? Well, the biggest release of the upcoming weekend is easily going to be, without a shadow of a doubt, Toy Story 5, which is looking at a massive box office debut if pre-sales tracking is to be believed. In fact, before I recorded the podcast, there is talk about potentially up to $150 million opening domestically. Imagine the worldwide opening we're looking at. Reactions have been better than I anticipated so far, and I'll be catching this one with general audiences because Disney continues its recent trend of not offering press screenings in my market. They gave Orlando 2 chances to watch the movie, but they gave me none here in Tampa. The only thing I can do is shrug and make the best of it. I actually binged all 4 Toy Story films over the weekend, and every single one every single one, including the much maligned Part 4, ranks among my favorite movies of its respective years. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what this latest installment has to offer. It's going to hit on what I think is a massive, massive issue going on right now. Parents just giving their toddlers and young kids these tablets uh to kind of like shut them up or keep them, babysit the kids for them instead of them engaging with the world or even engaging with fictional storytelling. um I think it's a major problem, and I hope that the movie addresses this like it teases that it will. A24, meanwhile, will be providing some indie concert programming with Michael Cernowski's The Death of Robin Hood, and return to original storytelling for the filmmaker after he dipped his toes into franchise material with 2024's A Quiet Place Day 1 prequel. The film centers on the legendary Outlaw's final days and boasts a pretty impressive cast led by Hugh Jackman in the title role. Netflix will be releasing another one of its straight to streaming romance films, by the way, Voicemails for Isabella. These movies, they tend to be pretty biting, but generally inoffensive, though I'm hoping this one pulls an office romance and ends up working better for me than most of the streamers' offerings in the genre. And last week, I mistakenly reported that the comedy Never Change was heading straight to Disney Plus and Hulu over the previous weekend. It turns out I had confused its release with a screening at a Tribeca Film Festival, the sort of forgotten film festival that I can't remember if they've even ever premiered a awards contender at. But the movie will actually arrive on those streaming platforms this coming weekend. And while we're at it, correcting that mistake, I made the same error regarding Netflix's In the Hand of Dante. It was not coming out to Netflix. I'm sorry for folks who heard that from me and ended up looking for it on Netflix this weekend. It was actually screening at Tribeca. It is not debuting this week. It will instead arrive on the streamer in 2 weeks from now. So it's coming. It's just I kind of jumped the gun on when I said it was coming. But yeah, this weekend, be on the lookout for Toy Story 5, The Death of Robin Hood, Voicemails for Isabella, and Never Change. So you got something at the box office and in streaming coming up this weekend. And I will tell you, I am super, super excited to check out Toy Story 5 based on these early reactions. All right. It is now time to talk about recent film industry news that caught my attention. Legendary Today Show film critic Gene Shalit, I hope I'm not butchering the man's last name, as I keep reminding you folks, I am not good with names. But he's instantly recognizable for his iconic look, featuring that big hair, the big mustache, the oversized glasses. He passed away this past week at the age of 100. Charlotte was a bit before my time compared to Siskel and Ebert, who I kind of caught near the end of their run when I was a kid. That said, he was still popping up in segments of the Today Show going into the late 2000s. And every time I've come across clips of him later in life, he always strikes me as one of those fun film critics, someone who never seemed to let his pretentiousness color his criticism. And it compared to someone like Rex Reed, who passed away a couple weeks ago, giant in the film criticism space. I gave tribute to him, but I did admit he wasn't my cup of tea with the whole sort of like mean girls kind of style towards film criticism. I've never been attracted to that kind of film criticism. James was different. He seemed to kind of keep a almost like a happy, I don't want to say happy warrior, like a happy a film goer kind of vibe to him, even if he didn't like a movie. And interestingly enough, he began his career as a press agent for Dick Clark before eventually transitioning to entertainment journalism and criticism. And over the decades, he became one of the most recognizable faces in film criticism, a fixture in morning TV. And I really hope future generations of film critics can capture some of the same sense of fun and personality that Gene brought whenever he appeared on screen. May he rest in peace and be in eternal light. R.I.P. Gene Shalit, one of the best to ever do it. And the Academy Awards have announced this year's Governor's Award honorees, with Glenn Close and Ridley Scott among those set to be recognized. Both Glenn Close and Ridley Scott, they've accumulated multiple Oscar nominations over the course of their careers without ever taking home a competitive win. And I will tell you, if it were up to me, both would already have multiple statues on their mantles. I mean, quite frankly, Glenn Close would probably have 3 or 4 Oscars if it were up to me, and Ridley Scott would at least have 2 of them. The Governor's Awards, they were once presented as part of the main Oscar telecast, but that changed a couple years ago because of this whole continuing battle about time and trying to get the show to be done quicker, and yet the show is consistently always like 3 hours and 30 minutes long. Um, they're now held at a private ceremony each November, and because it's in November, sort of as award season's kind of kicking off, it has become effectively the unofficial kickoff to awards campaign, especially when it comes to acting. It's sort of become this key networking event, and you will see like even like folks who are clear long shots. Like I remember back in 2022 at the Governor's Award that year, seeing Maya Goff was there for Pearl, and I loved her performance in Pearl. She's in my personal ballot for that year for Pearl, but I knew it wasn't gonna happen for her. And it was kind of so seeing her there, it was kind of like I don't think this is gonna happen. I would have loved to have been wrong, but I wasn't. It's kind of interesting the way that like everybody, even the biggest long shots, show up to try to kick off their acting award campaigns at the Governor's Award awards. And I should add, long time Disney animated Floyd Norman will also be receiving a statue. And he's a man who worked on 2 of my all-time favorite animated films, Sleeping Beauty and Mulan. It is amazing the career work that man has had, and I'm happy that he's getting recognized. But obviously, Glenn Close and Ridley Scott are the 2 big names. And there was apparently a bit of a leak that Harrison Ford was in the conversation, and I will tell you, Harrison Ford might not be, we don't know how much longer he's going to be with us, not to be morbid. Whereas I do think we still have some time with Glenn Close. But hey, I cannot complain about finally giving Glenn Close a statue or Ridley Scott a statue. Both of them deserve it. And I'm very happy that they will at least have us, something to feel recognition from the Academy from. And I'll tell you what, the Art Directors Guild fired back at Martin Scorsese's recent endorsement of generative AI, and it being used for storyboarding and production design. If you remember, I covered that on last week's podcast episode. And I'm going to go ahead and read the entire statement here. This is from the Art Directors Guild. They posted it on their social media. This is where it started getting retweeted all over the place. Um, and this is a response as follows. Mr. Scorsese, the business is not in flux. Oscar-winning director Martin Scorsese is turning his back on the human artists who throughout his career have helped him create his most memorable works. In the recently released Black Forest Labs video promoting their generative AI product Flux, Mr. Scorsese asked the question, how do you communicate what you see in your head to your cast and crew? He claims the solution is the use of this generative AI program to do the jobs that are rightfully the jurisdiction of Art Directors Guild Local 800 artists and designers. Human artists and designers who have been successfully collaborating with directors to visualize their films for decades. Mr. Scorsese's promotion of a generative AI product circumvents the input of Art Directors Guild Local 800 art directors, graphic artists, illustrators, production designers, scenic artists, set designers, and other talented union professionals. Generative AI is only capable of producing this type of cinematic intelligence by ingesting large swaths of copyrighted work, likely scrapped from the internet without consent, credit, compensation, or transparency. The skills of Art Directors Guild's local 800 artists and designers bring the highest level of value to any film or television production. To think their professional contributions can be mimicked or outshone by generative AI, which is built on work likely stolen from them and many other artists from around the world, is a betrayal of the collaborative nature of cinema. And that's where the statement ends there. And I will tell you, I think Martin Scorsese could. I mean, look, he's got this new movie coming out that's apparently Apple's hoping to potentially turn into an awards contender next year. It's supposed to be a bit of a psychological horror based on a book. It's going to star Leonardo DiCaprio, Jennifer Lawrence. They're going to be. It's about a couple who sort of are looking to, I believe, adopt a child. I believe the wife is technically dying from cancer. The film after that apparently is actually like getting close to being seriously begin the pre-production stage is this supposed Hawaiian mob thriller that will involve Leonardo DiCaprio, Emily Blunt, and Dwayne the freaking Rock Johnson, who I will talk about here later soon. Um, and I do gotta wonder, when you're doing this and coming after the work of these union professionals, can that affect you when it's time for the industry awards? Because these people will do backlash. I mean, Park Chan Wook has been having issues with getting his work recognized by the industry because he has had some, you know, disagreements with the DGA. The WGA has been known to be very prickly about what they will recognize. There's certain rules that have to be set if you want to be nominated by the WGA. Um, I remember leading up to the writers and actors strikes, I was watching the WGA award ceremony at the time, and it felt like it was almost like you were watching a union a meeting of everybody cheering about about the coal strike. People forget there are a lot of these people in these unions in the industry, particularly these people who work on visual effects, work on production design and such. These people are giving in 50, 60 out. 70 whatever crazy hours a week, even if it's for movies that don't go on to be well received. And it's one of the things that gets to me, that there are certain movies that come and go and they have decent or maybe not the greatest VFX, or they have pretty good art direction and such, or maybe the art direction could use help. But regardless what I feel about that those texts, those were put together by human hands and human minds. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. A lot of work. And those people don't get enough recognition, because when people think of Hollywood, when people think of the Oscars, they think, oh, it's a bunch of millionaires giving each other golden statues. But it's not necessarily that. Makeup artists and such like that, these people aren't getting an incredible amount of money. A lot of these people are still, maybe living paycheck to paycheck, living project to project. And this is why I support the art director skill coming out against this. Again, I am not going to tell you, I'm not going to sit here and preach to you and be performative like I don't use AI. I use AI. I use it to help me edit things. I use it to help me, I use it to kind of help me with some questions and such like that. But I don't support the generative use of it. I don't take if I ask a quick question as the be all end all. I continue to do more research into it to double check things. And you did art direction and storyboarding is something that should be left to humans. I do not trust any AI to do that for me. I cannot imagine asking AI to do things for me that I can do for that I should be able to do for myself where my voice will be lost. I want AI to be used as a tool, not to be used as something that's going to take over my heart and soul. And I think Scorsese really stepped into it. It's going to be interesting to see how much more the industry responds, considering that the Art Directors Guild came out and said this. And it's going to be a really fascinating thing to keep my eye on going forward, especially with Scorsese having, at the very least, we now know one more movie coming out. And talk about Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He recently opened up in an interview with Esquire magazine about a cancer scare that ultimately turned out to be a false alarm. He also made some candid remarks about his awards campaign for the Smashing Machine, which ultimately resulted in a Golden Globe nomination, but failed to translate to anything close to Oscar recognition. If I remember correctly, he didn't even make a BAFTA long list. Of the experience, Johnson said, and this is quoting none other than The Rock. Um, quote, "It would have been incredible to get nominated for an Oscar. I realized very quickly that it's a rare thing to reach this pinnacle where you're even in where you're even having these conversations, and it's exciting. It would have been amazing. I wish it happened, but it didn't. But in no uncertain terms did I ever think, oh, that doesn't matter. I always thought it mattered, and has lit a fire in my spine, which is let's get back to work." End quote. Um, I do think he is gonna have to, if he really wants this, and he says that it lit a fire into him. He's gonna have to be consistent about it. He's what's he following up the Smashing Machine with? A Moana live action film, and which apparently they announced today on as I record this podcast that they're going to do this all out multi-city tour. There is rumors that the movie is underperforming pre-sales, which surprises me considering the first Moana's gone on to be a classic for a lot of Generation Z, and the second movie did gangbusters. Even with the middling reviews and not getting anywhere near the award recognition that the first movie did. Um, you know, and then after that, he's got a Jumanji sequel, which, to be fair, I've found the Jumanji sequels to be pretty fun. I mean, I wouldn't rank any of them over the first film, which is a very special nostalgia treat for me. Um, but I will say I've been watching these trailers for the Moana live action, which quite frankly just looks like AI. Like I do not there are times that people are constantly whining about why does this look like this? Why look at the shades of gray and all this. I'm like, I can appreciate a pretty looking film and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, if you give me a fun story, it's why I love the Wicked films, even though the cinematography can be very mediocre. Um, but I have to say, I have to. It's hard not to notice how AI looking that movie looks. But the thing is that I'm watching The Rock in these trailers, and he looks checked out. And it's like this guy is so perfect for this Maui character. He really played him with a lot of passion in Moana, and even in Moana 2, which was what was supposed to be this TV series for Disney Plus that they canceled and collected together to create a sequel out of. And he apparently was one of those who pushed to get this done, this live action film. And I don't know. I do think he might have fire in him to do more serious stuff to sink his teeth into. But unfortunately for him, the Smashing Machine really peaked at Venice with the directing win there. And he was in my personal ballot for Best Actor, but that Best Actor, I mean, quite frankly, all four acting categories last year was ridiculously stacked. Ridiculously stacked. And to be frank with you, with the exception of supporting actor, I did think the Oscars kind of went with the weaker choices for the most, yeah, at least the weaker combination. It's not to say that everybody who was nominated was weak, but for me personally, were the weaker nominations, especially what I thought was a very underwhelming lead actress category. But if take out the Oscars out of the equation, all four acting categories I thought had really packed potential fields. And Best Actor was packed last year. It was stacked with a lot of great performances. And The Smashing Machine was a movie that was met with very divisive responses. It got okay reviews. The audience scores weren't great. It did awful at the box office. I like the movie more than not, than a lot of other people seem to. Now, it was a vibes movie, and if you didn't get with the vibe of the slice of life feel to it, I can see why you found it boring. But he was great in the film. Even though I do have some questions, and others brought this up about his his ability to cry because he kept covering his eyes when he cried in the movie. But other than that, I thought it was a really great performance. If it were up to me, he would have been nominated for an Oscar for it. But he's got to be consistent now. He's apparently going to be doing this this new A24 film coming up where he's going to be playing, I guess, like some kind of cult guy who's leading a cult or something like that. And and of course, he's apparently going to be working with Scorsese. I'm fascinated to see how Martin Scorsese directs The Rock. Um, but he's gonna have to stay consistent if he really wants this. And I will say, looking at the trailer snippets I've seen of Moana, this he looks to me checked out. And I really hope that he is serious about this because I want to see him push himself. I want to see him do more serious stuff. And by the way, props to him about being candid about wanting it. I'm not offended by people want. I don't know why people act all offended when someone's like, "I want the Oscar." Yeah, why wouldn't you? I mean, like, come on, what's so weird like that? There are many things that I want. Everybody does. If I were an actor, I would want an Oscar. So, but yeah, I really hope he's serious about this, and I hope that after we get through this Moana and Jumanji sequel, that we see him be more serious stuff. Meanwhile, talk about other candid interviews. Jennifer Lopez recently took a swipe at Nomadland, the 2020 Best Picture winner, saying, "It's not, quote, it's not why I go to the movies. I like musicals. I like romantic comedies. I like thrillers, and Nomadland is a slow moving thing about grief, and there's no escapism to it. And I do like some movies like that, but that one I just didn't. It's just a tasting, and I know we need movies about grief. I understand," unquote. Um, Nomadland was my preferred winner out of that year's Best Picture lineup, which I don't consider to be a particularly strong Best Picture lineup. I know there are other people who might disagree with me, but you know, and by the way, Nomadland is also one of my favorite films of 2020. I should mention that. But I honestly understand where Lopez is coming from because, quite frankly, the film was helped by the fact that 2020 ended up being a relatively weak year for cinema due to the pandemic. I know there are people get really annoyed and angry if you believe that there were some weaker years for film, but I do think 2020 was was a weaker year for film. It's not to say that there weren't some good, great films. I mean, there were films there that I gave an A+ grade to. Um, but I do think the pandemic affected that year to be a weaker year. There were stories of Academy members who refused to take part in Oscar voting because they basically saw it as a lost year for film. Um, and I have to say, I'm not convinced Nomadland would have won Best Picture had it been released in most other recent years. And if we're being honest, this headline about Jennifer Lopez talking about Nomadland is probably the first time many people have even thought about the movie in quite a while. It does increasingly feel like it's one of those Oscar winners that will age into being generally forgotten, not because it's bad. I mean, while you understand where J-Lo is coming from, the movie actually has some pretty decent audience scores. Um, but because it emerged from what many consider a lost year for movies. The film lacks the kind of lasting pop cultural footprint that other Best Picture winners have had, especially some of the Best Picture winners we've been on a roll with. Um, I still consider Nomadland one of the best films released of that year, and I do think it's a tremendous achievement by Chloe Zhao. I don't want to make it this sound like I suddenly throwing the movie, you know, under the bus. It is a blend of documentary style realism. There's some deeply human storytelling that worked for me. Um, but at the same time, I completely understand why someone looking for entertainment, escapism, or more of a conventional narrative experience, might bounce off of it. So in that regard, I get where J Lo is coming from. And it's interesting because I remember when Nomadland won Best Picture, I thought this is a movie that might end up making the sight and sound. There's just going to be a lot of conversations about how it best represents what we went through in 2020. And I have to say, since then, it's really kind of been a forgotten film. It's kind of fallen into what I would consider the asterisk Best Picture winners, the ones that I kind of just remembered as answer the trivia question: who won Best Picture that year? I honestly feel like Zhao's stuff since then, Hamnet is. I think it's probably going to have more of a lasting impact than Nomadland. And it's not like I think Hamnet is going to be some, incredible classic, but I think it's, the audience scores for that movie have been more better than what we saw for Nomadland. I just think it was able to win because it wasn't the greatest, the most strongest year for movies. So I get where J Lo's coming from. I'm not even though I think it's a great film. I think it's one of the. I actually rewatched the movie last year, and it was still just as good as I remembered. But it's also not going to be one of my making my old timer list either. Um, but I get where she's coming from. Now that being said, I am a bit less forgiving of Luca Guadagnino, who recently decided to take a shot at Top Gun Maverick, saying, quote, "It's a very bad movie. People liked it because the economy of nostalgia right now seems to be the only commodity that can be dominated by all types of markets," and unquote. And with all due respect to Luca and his biggest fans out there, because there are people who think he's like so great. They love his stuff. All of his almost, if not all, almost all of his movies are among their favorites of the year. I have to say, this is coming from the same filmmaker who directed what I thought was a very mediocre movie that could have been a lot better in After the Hunt. And in my view, he has yet to make a film anywhere near as strong as Maverick. Now, I have seen some people saying, well, what about Challengers? Well, I would include Challengers in that assessment as well. I mean, I'm probably gonna piss off some big Challengers fans on this. I'm baffled at how much people like that movie. It did arguably come generally close to a Best Picture nomination. It didn't get no Oscar noms, but like it did place at WGA. It did get Golden Globes. It did get HCA. It was probably in the mix for an editing nomination and I want to say score nomination. I didn't make the score shortlist, but so I do think it was probably a little bit closer than people think. Like maybe like borderline 15, 16 in Best Picture, something like that. And it did like if you base a a critic's best of the year list sample out of 1,000 plus that year, it actually broke the top 10. So I know I'm saying some things that are unpopular to say among film critics right now. I do not think Challengers in any way, shape, or form close to as good as Top Gun Maverick. I mean, like polyamorous, watching two guys get cucked thing, as amazing as the tennis is, as amazing as the editing is, as amazing as that score is, and I did put it on my personal ballot for editing and score, even though I was more underwhelmed by the movie than others. That is not as good. I'm sorry, that is not as good as Top Gun Maverick, and none of Lucas' movies, which most of them I think are good at some level, I would place as good as Top Gun Maverick. Um, But that said, I can't say I'm particularly surprised by this, from Luca. He has always struck me as someone who, shall we say, he has fairly highbrow taste. He tends to look at more popular cinema with a skeptical eye, which makes his near miss involvement with a DC project all that more surreal. Remember, he was supposed to direct a DC film. I forget the name of it. It was Sergeant. Was it Sergeant Rock or something like that? It was like a little known DC character, but then the project fell apart. But Luca, like he just does not seem like the kind of director that he and I would necessarily have the same likes of cinema. He's I think he's an Academy member. I'd have to double check, but if he is, like, he's not the guy who's putting movies like Barbie and Wicked in his best. In his best picture ballot. So I'm not that surprised that he took a swipe at Top Gun Maverick, but I have to say, this is coming from a guy who I would not say he's yet achieved something as good as Top Gun Maverick. And I know there's probably a couple Luca fans who have listened to this and they disagree vehemently. Everybody has his right to their opinion, but I wouldn't. I have to say, I'm still waiting for Luca to give me something that I like as much as I did Top Gun Maverick. And speaking of filmmakers putting their foot in their mouth, Jane Campion, who's always developed a reputation for occasionally making some tone deaf public comments, uh, she may have delivered one of her dumbest gaffes yet. In discussing her past working relationship with Harvey Weinstein on the piano, and yes, that Harvey Weinstein, she said, quote, "Can I say one thing that's going to be very disturbing? Like that's ever stopped her in the past. Harvey Weinstein, as we know, did some horrific things, but he also did some great things for the arts and for getting audiences. He was bold in that way. He loved films. I have to admit, the marketing strategy was his vision." Unquote. Comments like this from Campion are not exactly new. She has made a number of remarks over the years that have fairly or unfairly complicated aspects of her public perception, or definitely her movie's awards chances, including during the Power of the Dogs awards campaign, which, along with its divisive audience reception, contributed to one of the more dramatic shits I've ever seen between nomination and morning and Oscar night for a film. If people will remember, the Power of the Dog got 12 nominations. It looked like it was on its way to winning Best Picture on nomination morning. And then Coda just came in and nearly swept all of the guilds. It only didn't win DGA because it wasn't even nominated at DGA. And that, in my opinion, is the one movie that would not have gotten in if there were just 5 nominees for Best Picture and went on to win Best Picture because of getting in because of the expanded ballot. I will never forget watching the nominee luncheon interviews that year and how many people watching that movie were watching that movie for the first time and commenting on it and bringing it up and talking about how it made them cry. And I do not hate Coda. I do not hate Coda, but it is my least favorite Best Picture winner of the expanded ballot. And quite frankly, it might be my least favorite Best Picture next to maybe Crash of the 21st century for me personally. And I think it's a good movie. Like it's a good movie. Don't get me wrong, but it's like one of the rare Best Picture winners that wasn't even like in my personal top 20 of the year. Which, to be fair, there are plenty of people out there that they have several Best Picture winners that aren't in their personal top 20 of that year. But my tastes tend to align with the Academy, and almost a lot of times, Best Picture winners will make my best of the year list, if not top 10, top 20. And Coda was the last time that hasn't happened. And again, I don't think it's a bad movie. I have it logged as a 3.5 on Letterboxd, which is how I feel about that film. But and I do think it's ridiculous personally that it beat Power of the Dog, which I think it's a superior film. It was one of my favorite films of that year, even though I did find it a little weird that given some of the other choices we could have gone with, that's what critics decided to get behind as the movie of that year. But, you know, consensus always wins out. And again, I can't complain too much because it was one of my favorite films that year. I think I had a number 10 last I checked my personal ranking of 2021. And that campaign had this meltdown as more and more people started complaining that they didn't vibe with that film. The audience scores were not good for that movie. Not anywhere near as bad as Emilia Perez, but they weren't good. And I remember she made a comment when she won the director's prize at Critics' Choice, where it almost came off like she was dismissing Venus and Serena because they didn't have to play against the guys. Now, Venus and Serena were reportedly not offended at all by this. I remember Mark Johnson, who people should follow on Twitter, and he's a very good Oscars predictor. He does work with Awards Watch. He at the time was with another outlet, and he was on because he's a Critics' Choice member. He was on the table with Serena and Venus, and from what he said, nobody was offended by that, and that comment blew up and really became an issue for her. And all of a sudden, like, Power the Dog just kept becoming this like villain of the campaign. And I remember I did the very night after the Oscars, because of everybody was talking about, you know, Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, which unfortunately, I mean, that 2021 ceremony was a freaking disaster. A disaster. And instead of people talking about Coda, people were talking about Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, which instantly I knew right there that Coda wouldn't be ages a particularly well remembered Best Picture winner. But I remember I was did a hit on Her Talk with Andrew Donaldson, and he wanted me to comment about the situation with Jane Campion and Power the Dog completely flopping. And he, you know, I could tell he was among those who wasn't a big fan of what they heard from Jane Campion. She also went after Sam Elliott, because Sam Elliott made some comments against the movie that I thought were ridiculous, and then he apparently apologized for them. But you know, a lot of people love Sam Elliott for understandable reasons. I love Sam Elliott, and it just and I remember when she accepted her Oscar, excuse me, which was the only Oscar Power the Dog won. It went from 12 nominations to only winning the director Oscar, which quite frankly, she only won the director Oscar because it had become almost like a thing to check mark her name off. I remember she kind of like made this like dismissal remark about Kevin Costner's speech, because he did a pretty I did think it was a little bit of an over dramatic presentation of the Oscar for Best Director, but like I remember she kind of this kind of mocking dismissal of it when she came on screen. It's just like, it just hit me like she just doesn't have a filter sometimes, and I think it could rub people off the wrong way. This right here is one of the dumbest things I've heard from her, though, because a lot of the times that I think she's put her foot in her mouth, I've always felt like I get where she's coming from, but I think that she kind of gaffed. This, I mean, like you can't you cannot give Harvey Weinstein this kind of like a love and attention. The man raped women. The man bullied directors. The man was known to be a tyrant. The man used a incredibly dirty campaign to pull off that upset over Saving Private Ryan. She mentions the Working the Piano, which was arguably the number 2 film for Best Picture that year, lost to Schindler's List. And look, The Piano's a great movie, But I'm glad Schindler's List won because A, I think it's a better film, and B, I think more people have remembered Schindler's List, whereas The Piano is still a respected movie. It's generally considered by many to be Campion's best work, but it doesn't have anywhere near the footprint that Schindler's List does. Um, and what she's talking about is Harvey Weinstein because he did do some aggressive campaigning with that movie. Like I think there was a story that and because there were a few critics groups that actually went with Piano over Schindler's List, including the Southeastern Critics Association, which I'm a big fan of that Critics Association, and they actually were one of the very few that went with the Piano over Schindler's List, and um, I think it was National Board of Review or someone like Feinstein messed around with the wording of the recognition they gave the Piano to make it seem like it was getting more lauded than Schindler's List was because everyone knew that year, at least from the contemporary stuff that I've read and seen, that Schindler's List basically had the Oscar one, that this was going to be Spielberg's moment. Um, and so I guess that's what she's talking about. But a lot of the way that he pushed that movie. Um, but you have to be careful with talking about a serial rapist and bully like this. This is one of the worst human beings in the industry's, uh, you know, history to have existed. Like Louis B. Mayer pulled off a lot of things for the industry, but the top thing that I think about is his reputation as a horrible human being who supposedly also tried to throw his weight around um and victimize women. I'm a generally sex positive guy. I have no problem if guys want to go out there and try to play the field as long as everybody is consenting and knows what's going on. But like, it shouldn't have to be said that you know horrible things the way these Harvey Weinstein and some of these guys victimize women. Um, and I just think this is just yet another gaffe by this one. It's just another reminder that she has a tendency to create these avoidable distractions where she could be more restrained and stuff. Now, the other thing that I will say that came out of this is that apparently she is planning her next movie, and she says that it's going to be a musical. I don't know if I can see Jane Campion pulling off a musical, but she is a good director. She has made some great films that I have loved. I own Power the Dog, by the way. Um, I want to own The Piano as well when I get the chance. Um, but I really, really think it would help her to get a little bit more PR training because this has just been this consistent thing with her. You cannot go out there and try to make defenses of Harvey Weinstein. All right, and that pretty much should cover a lot of the film news over the last week that got my attention. So, what else is on my mind that is not film related? Well, the 2026 NBA Finals wrapped up, and I do have to congratulate the New York Knicks on defeating the San Antonio Spurs in 5 games, including pulling off back-to-back major comebacks to close out the series. I was personally rooting for San Antonio, but it has been surreal to watch the Knicks finally win the big one. It was really cool to see Spike Lee celebrate. He's been a season ticket holder for 40 plus years. I spent a couple months, watching Ben Stiller on his X account basically turned that into a Knicks fan page. So I'm happy for him as well. Um, I do have to wonder though about some of the more obvious bandwagoners who suddenly appeared out of nowhere. But um, I'm not going to mention certain names, but props to the actual Knick fans. Their long national nightmares finally over. I'm a Heat fan. I've gotten to see my team win 3 championships while also losing 4 finals. So I understand the adulation the Knick fans are experiencing. I understand the heartbreak San Antonio's experiencing. And especially considering the amount of head scratching basketball that young Spurs team. was playing down the stretch in those games they choked away. I mean, just some stupid basketball. Just going for like 8 straight threes when you're up by double digits and stuff like that. Like, I was blown away by some of the stupid basketball that I saw the Spurs play. But the Knicks took advantage. They won the series in 5. You wouldn't have known that the Spurs were the ones with home court advantage. You wouldn't have known that the Spurs were the ones who won 60 games. In comparison, I believe the Knicks only won like 53 in comparison during the regular season. But, they were down 2-1 to the Hawks, and then they just locked in and won every single game but one after that. And what's the one game that they lost? The one that Donald Trump showed up with. Showed up at. I don't think that's a coincidence. Meanwhile, the 2026 Stanley Cups also came to an end the very next day, actually, as the Carolina Hurricanes came back from down 2-1 in the series to win 3 straight games and beat the Las Vegas Golden Knights in 6 games 4-2. I warned you, Knight fans, last week that a 2-1 series lead in a Stanley Cup final is never something to feel safe about. And well, here we are. Congrats to the Hurricanes on their second championship. And it looks like we now have teams from California, Carolina, and Florida that have won multiple cup titles since the last time a Canadian team won. I mean, I think that really says it all, that we are now on 30 or so years since a Canadian team won a Stanley Cup final. And, Hurricane fans should not give a damn about what I'm about to say, but I do think that the NHL probably would have preferred Vegas had won. And I gotta wonder how Vegas fans are feeling, because they look like they were starting to die. They were watching the end of the run they have been on, where they actually got to the Stanley Cup final in their very first year, and then they finally won the final after a lot of playoff heartbreak a couple years ago. But then like they actually were coached by Tortorella, who was the guy who coached my Lightning to their first ever Stanley Cup win. And he just like took this team that had a losing record and barely got into playoffs and took them all the way to the Stanley Cup finals. And I had predicted them to win, but the Hurricanes just were too much to handle. They've been building this Hurricanes team for a couple years now, and I knew some people who thought that they could go on a run, but I have to say, I do wonder if my Lightning had just gotten through the Canadians, if this could have been them instead of the Hurricanes. But congrats to the Hurricanes, they earn it. But I will say that I would like to see a little bit more of an exciting team and story next year with the Stanley Cup Finals. The 2026 World Cup has officially kicked off as well. North American countries are the hosts, and plenty of U.S. venues are staging matches. And let me tell you, as I watched social media erupt with excitement over the opening weekend for it, the biggest story to me wasn't anything that happened on the pitch. It was how cheap the concession prices were or are at Atlanta's Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Apparently, they're offering hot dogs for just $2 and liquor for under $10. I mean, like, this immediately made me think about how I had to pay double or even triple those prices when I went to see Metallica at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa last summer. Anyhow, I'm not going to pretend to be a soccer guy or care all that much about the World Cup or be performative about my rooting interest in Team USA's chances. But this is the Super Bowl for a lot of other people. It's I don't follow soccer, but more power to those who are excited for the event. And I hope you Atlanta folks appreciate how good you have it when it comes to concession prices at your local football stadium. And finally, Father's Day weekend is coming up. And for me, it will be a special one because it will be my first time getting to celebrate it as a dad. At this point last year, I had no idea I was going to become a dad. So it's kind of wild to think that here I am a year later with a 4-month-old little woman to take care of. So, my best wishes to all the dads out there this weekend. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to be, what my plans are for my first ever Father's Day. So, whether you're a new dad like me, a seasoned veteran, somewhere in between, I do hope you have a great Father's Day coming up. And that will do it for this episode of the Mendez Movie Report podcast. Remember, you can find all my work at mendezmoviereport.com. You can find me on all social media, YouTube, Letterboxd, X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, even Reddit, Gold Derby, and the Award Expert app, all under Mendez Movie RPT. If you want to email me, author, as in a writer, authorlmendez at gmail.com. And that wraps it up for this week. I will see you all next week as I react to Toy Story 5. Hopefully, have a really good first ever Father's Day weekend. Until then, do me a big favor. Do me a big favor. Go watch a great movie for me.